Guys, congratulations on Cargo.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Just quickly, can you give me some facts and figures? How long did it take to develop? How long did it take to make? How much did it cost?
So, I mean, we started with the short concept back in, it was like mid-2012. That was just the genesis of the idea. Took Yolanda a few months to get the script written for the short. And then we produced that in like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, I think, including all kind of post. And then off the back of that, then it was, a couple of months later it was released, went online. It was May 2013 that we went over to the USA to meet with agents and producers and start discussing an expanded version of Cargo. So May 2013 to...
Yeah, I mean, I guess the feature development process all up, script-wise, was about 3 years.
Right.
But of course, in tandem with all that, you're trying to raise financing and you're casting and you're scouting and all of that.
Right.
So it was very much like ebbs and flows.
Now, it didn't win Tropfest, but you didn't even place yet. The film was impressive enough to attract attention from overseas?
That's right, yeah. Yeah, it was sort of, we got very lucky. Tropfest put it up on their channel, and we just had a few big pop culture websites kind of pick it up and share it. And because they had such a big built-in audience, that was sort of how the view count started to really take off. And then it was about that point, about 1.5 million views or so, that we had American agents reach out.
So this is literally an example of someone putting a short film up online.
Yeah.
And getting Hollywood attention, or getting US attention, major US attention, which would have been crucial to the film getting made.
Totally, yeah. It's kind of like we were inadvertently, I guess, part of a new momentum of proof of concept short films. Whereas like initially it was like you make a short film just as a calling card to kind of get your name out there, do the festival run. But then I guess YouTube by 2012 had reached such a level of prominence that we could have viral success on that, and then that could open doors to the industry because it shows that you've already got an audience, you can connect with people just off gross numbers.
Now, congratulations on the film. It is a terrific thriller, very atmospheric, very well paced, very well structured. I'd like to get into how you assembled the film in a few moments.
Yeah.
But just first, broadly, how would you guys describe what the film is about?
I guess we would say it's kind of twofold for us. I think the real beating heart of the story is that tale of parental love, or the story of a father trying to save his baby, and the flip side to that being Tumi's character trying to save her own father. So that idea of love and sacrifice and how far parents will go to protect their kids. So I think that's sort of, I guess you could say, the A story, or the driving ticking clock element. And then the other big part of the story that came out, having the opportunity to make the feature version in an expanded kind of canvas, was the Indigenous content in the film. Yeah.
Tell me a bit about the Indigenous aspect of the film.
Yeah.
You found it very important to have that in the film. Tell me a bit about that. Why did you do that?
Yeah, that was, I mean, the idea was kind of born from, we didn't set out initially to make an Australian zombie film. And it was just when discussing, like, what haven't we seen in a zombie world? How can we kind of push the envelope a bit? We just started thinking, even from a very logical point of view, that people who have an ability to live off the land and a connection to the land, particularly through like kind of traditional means, such as like Indigenous Australians, or just Indigenous people anywhere in the world, really, would ironically have more of an advantage than the way they're kind of like represented currently. So we just like that idea. Just a bit of it being an ironic twist and also being logically pretty accurate. And that we just kind of followed it from there. And then like the actual, as we researched it more, there was just so many little nuances of practice and stuff that we could like use to feed into actually like a very kind of sustainable world.
Yeah, on sort of like a thematic level as well, we were just really interested in what that might bring to the film. And, some of our favourite films in sci-fi and horror are obviously those that sort of have that added layer of social commentary, or at least a striving to add something more. And so that was what we were sort of aspiring to do with that side of the story. But of course, being white filmmakers, that's very delicate territory, and you have to approach that in the right way. So that was, part of our
Can we just unpack that for a second, because you just touched on a very interesting aspect of modern horror films. If we take the first Dawn of the Dead film as the beginning of the new era of the zombie genre, or of the horror genre, if you like, but the idea of threading in social commentary or some sort of political satire or another meaning to the film below the horror content has been part and parcel of it since the beginning.
Absolutely.
Even Eli Roth says that his hostel movies, his horrific torture porn films, but all of them, he says, they deliberately put in content so that the third, fourth, fifth time you're watching it, you're picking up something beneath the horror thing. So you guys were aware of this?
Very much so, yeah. And I think, I mean, yeah, very much so. And that there were a number of different ways, I guess, that we were trying to kind of play with that. I think one of them was the idea of, you know, casting an English actor in the lead role. We thought, again, without ever wanting to be like didactic about it, because I think that if you push that agenda too hard, then people just check out. And that's what genre gives you a chance to do, is you have that prism of distance that people can kind of, you know, you're watching it through that supernatural, so you're not feeling preached to, I suppose. But we felt like casting an English actor in that role would also, just by nature of his nationality and the history of this country, might sort of have that element just sitting there under the surface that people may or may not pick up on.
Right. Now, I love the fact that this isn't so much a post-apocalypse film as a post-apocalypse film.
Yeah, right.
It's like the end of the world has settled in.
Yeah.
And this is now the new part of the world. Can you just tell me a little bit about the fabric or the narrative landscape that you wanted to evoke in contrast to all the other zombie movies that are out there? I mean, you have not gone for the marauding mob zombie movies, which are beautiful and brilliant, and Wormwood, the illustrated film, was a wonderful example of that, but you haven't gone in that direction. So tell me just a bit about how you defined the territory that you wanted to occupy with this film, and how that contrasts to the zombie films that you have seen.
Yeah, I mean, like, one thing is that whilst we did love zombie films, and part of the inspiration initially was off the back of like season 1 Walking Dead and seeing how Darabont had kind of handled them. We didn't actually, it wasn't something that we were really diving into to try and specifically make like a zombie film. Like, a lot of our touchstones and references were genre films of other kind of like genres, so like sci-fi, District 9, stuff like that. So we weren't necessarily trying to tap into the really kind of classic tropes and stuff, apart from using as a shorthand. And then in terms of the landscape, it was really a thing of like, we didn't want to show the origin. It wasn't an origin story in terms of here's patient zero, here's the first bite. It was, because we've seen that and it's been done really well before. It's not necessary for us to try and tell that again or tell our unique spin. And also, we just love the idea that, like, you know, what you don't see, what you imagine is more powerful than what you see quite often. And so leaving little gaps like that and leaving it as something for people to chew on after the film, during the film, whenever, it's kind of like, it's a game in a way. So yeah, we kind of just love to just throw people into the middle. This is where we start.
Yeah.
Catch up.
Now, you're both credited as director, but every time I talk to filmmakers who claim to have co-directed a film, I always like to make the point that, you know, I guess it's from the David Lynch film Mulholland Drive, where the cowboy is explaining to the filmmaker, you know, there are two people in the buggy, but one of them has the reins. Now, in all honesty, who was the director? Who was the co-director? Or did you, or will you push back at me and say...
No, I would honestly say, and I think this really comes from A, the fact that we've been friends for over a decade, B, that we genuinely developed the story together from the get-go over 3 years. So it wasn't a case of somebody had written a script and then a director's come on board later in the game, and then there's sort of that weird power imbalance. So for us, because of that, I think it was always an even keel. And I mean, look, to be honest as well, look, there are things where there are skill sets that we each have, I think, that kind of complement each other. So Ben's background in sort of shooting and editing more so, and for me, having trained as an actor and having written. So for me, story and performance was more my sort of natural, where my brain kind of went, and Ben sort of had a bit more of the technical. But there was always crossing over. It was a constant conversation of, you know, checking in with one another. And the reality is we just tried to do as much of that work as we could before we got on set, because obviously it's so important to have that unified voice and notes when you're dealing with actors and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I would say even split.
By sheer good fortune, I saw the Jacobson Brothers movie Brothers Nest this morning,
right.
which was written by someone called Jamie Brown, and they have the story is just so tight. It's a fun, dark little thriller. Your film also is very, very, from what I can tell, the script must have been worked over so many times, because there were no real holes in the film, which even in a zombie film you look for. There's an internal logic to the world that you've created, which is absolutely consistent. Thanks. What I want to know is how intensively you worked on the screenplay to squeeze out all the air bubbles to make sure that it was tight and you signed off on a script before you started shooting.
Oh wow, it's so interesting because, and obviously this being our first film, and this was the first feature script that I had ever written, so you know there is an element of learning as you go. It really was a case of learning how to do that as I was doing that. But I think I can't imagine it working any other way. But the way it worked for us is we did have 2.5, maybe 3 years of script development throughout, you know, just the sort of regular process of making a film. And then it was once we sort of got into pre-production and you're bringing these brains on board like a first AD who were saying, actually, we cannot shoot that script with this schedule and with this money. Like, we just cannot get every scene. And so I think as a writer, that can be really hard at first, because you're like, well, there are all these other layers, like nuances and details and character moments and things that we want to include in this story. And you have to get really judicious about what you can afford to lose and what you can't. And sometimes, and I think for the most part, actually, those cuts that we made in pre to the script were very wise moves and actually did make the story a lot tighter, and you realise we didn't need that stuff. But it's a constant, you lock it as much as you can before you go in, because the last thing you want to be doing is making rushed story decisions on a set where there's just time pressures, and you don't want to kind of screw it up by making a snap decision, you know. But I think also the reality of the schedule made it tricky at times too. So
what difference did getting Martin Freeman on board make to the green lighting of this film?
Martin's, it was a massive coup to be able to get him on board. He kind of had, he's obviously got like a lot of kind of pulling power and is as they call it, like a bankable name. So it just helped take the film from what could have been like a low budget film to, you know, a very modest budget, a very kind of, would you say modest? No.
I'd say modest budget given the ambition of the script, but a very generous budget for first-time filmmakers. I would say. I lost the word for a second. I
was being modest about how generous it was. No, it was a very healthy budget, and it was all really afforded by, having Martin there as a very kind of like 100%. Sellable name.
If you had another $5 million, how different would the film would be?
Honestly, it's hard to know, because it's like, even though, because we, you know, you see a budget like what we had, and you just say, oh wow, that's a lot of money, especially compared to like, we made the short film for $5,000. So it's just like, wow, think about all the stuff we can do for that. And it's just amazing as you go through it, like how much money actually kind of gets eaten up by production processes and doesn't make it onto screen. And it's simple things that have to happen. You know, if you want to go shoot in a remote location, you've got to pay for accommodation for everyone to be out there, and all the travel and everything like that, getting around back and forth. So yeah, it's hard. I don't know if we've got a complete grasp on what would have been done differently. It would have bought us more time, hopefully. But maybe it wouldn't, because Martin was only available for the window that we had.
Yeah, that's right too. So we did have that sort of tight 6 weeks or just over, with a week of pre with Martin. That was his window. So it was either, and we knew that we really wanted him for the part. So it's kind of, you want to make that work. I think just within the process of that shoot though, we just did have some really unfortunate luck with weather, and with just losing some serious shooting time as a result of that. So the trade-off there, and I think where, you know, more time, more money, where you would see that, I think in a storytelling way, would just be more coverage, more options of coverage. You know, there were times where we were just really up against it and had to cover a scene in 3-4 shots,
Yeah.
and it's like it breaks your heart a little bit because you're like, you've got all these ideas about how you want to like shoot this scene, and it's like it comes down to like, okay, but we just need the scene. Ultimately, we need the film won't make sense without that bloody scene. So let's just make sure we get the scene.
Are you familiar with that old saying about making a film that at the beginning of the day you're shooting Gone with the Wind?
Yeah.
By the end of the day, you're shooting the Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah, exactly.
Just shoot it. Just
Yes.
get it on camera.
Exactly.
So what's the life of the film? It opens on the 17th of May.
Mm-hmm.
What is the life of the film locally and internationally?
So we have a theatrical run as of May 17 in Australia, and then as of the 18th of May, the following day, it will be on Netflix everywhere else in the world except Australia. And then once the Oz theatrical and DVD window has closed, which is sort of about 6 months, I think, it will be on Netflix in Australia later this year as well.
How much difference has streaming made to the practicalities of getting a feature film done?
Yeah, I mean, a lot, I think.
The fact that you're going to be releasing in America on
Yeah.
streaming
Yeah.
the day after a theatrical release here
Yeah.
must be a big plus. Does this help in the deal making?
Well, it's interesting. We didn't set out to make a film that we didn't know it was going to go that way. So Netflix actually came in right just as we were starting the edit. So we didn't have a cut of the film at that point. And you know, obviously before that, we just sort of imagined the more traditional sort of theatrical, try and sell it territory by territory type approach. But it just, I mean, we're watching Netflix. The people we know are watching Netflix. The idea of trying to get a film into all of these different countries when the theatrical landscape is just changing, and it's so hard. It's so hard, and we just thought, you know what, these guys have 190 million countries. 190 countries and like 125 million subscribers. And the goal as filmmakers is to get eyes on your film, right? You just want to be able to share that with people. And given the viral success of the short, the streaming kind of approach it kind of made sense to us, didn't it? Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even the streaming platform landscape is going to change. So it's
Yeah.
like just before we got picked up, early in our post process, it was that phase of films would go to Sundance or Cannes or something, and they'd screen there, and then Netflix and Amazon would have a bidding war over them. And then I think it's seen even more of a shift now, where it's they're getting in earlier, so they'll try and jump in like post, like they did with us, or they'll even get in from development conception. And you've just seen that the trends kind of really shift from year to year. So it's quite it's interesting. It's a very changing landscape.
It's an exciting time, I think,
Yeah.
to be making movies. Yeah.
Now, Yolanda, you said you were 32, and Ben, you are...
36.
Okay, so, you people are so young. You kids are babies. I grew up, I was born in 62, so zombies for me were an easy get, because the 70s was when basically they exploded. So it was easy, it's easy for me to explain why I love zombie films.
Yeah.
But how do people from your generation get introduced to the zombie genre, and how do you guys explain from your point of view, the appeal of zombies? Because you can choose anything. You can choose aliens, vampires, alien hosts and human, anything you like. When did you guys get into zombies, and what is the appeal of them to you?
That's a really good question. I'm trying to think the first one that I would have seen that had an impact.
Yeah, I feel like my first kind of exposure to zombies would have been through video games, and like cartoon video games as well, where they weren't necessarily this threat. It was more like, by that point, pop culture had taken zombies that had come out in the 60s and 70s and then turned them into these kind of like cartoon pastiches of themselves and worked them into video games. And so that was how I came to know them, and then it wasn't until... That was probably 28 days later that really put them
For
back
our
on the map.
generation, that was probably the touchstone. Okay. And obviously that's very untraditional with them being fast moving, and it's a totally different vibe, right? But for us, I think that was exciting because I think that was the first time where I thought like, oh shit, you could do something different with these things. Like you can actually take certain conventions and rely on the audience understanding of how that works, but actually add your own flavour to it. And in terms of the appeal, I mean, I think it just taps into the concept of a zombie being like a shell of a human being who have lost all control of their body and losing your mind, right? Like as a person, it's just such a terrifying idea. I just think that that's kind of what makes it so timeless and effective, is this idea of losing yourself or losing a loved one, but they're still there, but they're not there, you know. And I think, and we, you know, that's something that happens to people too when they get ill, you know, with dementia and that. So there's all these parallels, and I think it's tapping into something that's very frightening for people, I think.
Yeah.
And did you guys go through the George A. Romero back catalogue and look at all the other zombie films?
I think we tried to do our due
We went over
diligence.
bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we definitely found that there were other films and from
Mm-hmm.
other genres that were touchstones for what we'd want to do, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now another genre that this film falls into is the end of the world genre.
Mm-hmm.
So the zombie genre is actually a subgenre of a larger
Yeah.
genre of end of the world movies, which started kicking in at around the time in the late 90s when this whole Mayan calendar prophesizing of the end of the world, all these other strange cults were talking about the end of the world.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you guys have had any thoughts whatsoever between the relationship between all of these end of the world films coming out in a pretty concentrated bunch over a couple of decades, and the relationship between that and the supposed real end of the world that we're meant to have seen. I'm wondering whether you guys are actually channeling the collective fear that we had for an actual end of the world. That is the most convoluted and
No, I totally
stupid question.
No, I totally get what you're saying. Because I think from where we sit, it's less about the whole Y2K thing. It's actually like the destruction of our planet is actually a really fucking legitimate concern now, here and now, with like climate change and with all of this stuff that's kind of going on. So I feel like that is still very much a concern. So it was less about thinking back to the 90s films and more about where are we now, what are we dealing with, grappling with now, and sort of playing with these ideas of taking from the land and what ramifications that might have. And again, never wanting to kind of ram that down people's throats, but just sort of leave that there as a layer for people to explore. Yeah.
And I think the reason why you get clumps of end of the world films kind of speaks to where society's at the time.
Yeah.
So there's multiple reasons why it could or couldn't be, but it could be a fact that there's a level of complacency and everything's kind of just slowly slipping through the cracks along the way, but deep down everyone kind of knows there's something kind of like wrong that needs to be like grossly upheaved, and it's like these movies either kind of come out as a premonition, as a warning, or as even just like an outlet, like an outburst of just like come on, fuck, can we do something? Can we acknowledge it? Otherwise we end up here. So it's kind of like just tapping into the zeitgeist in a way. The other thing as well, or it could just be that everyone's just really happy, and so we want something that's completely contrast what we're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, and then it's like, well, shock me, make me feel different.
Yeah, I read this amazing article in, I think it was The Atlantic a little while back, and they were talking about the idea of post-apocalyptic films traditionally being like dystopian, but the take of this article was saying actually there's a real utopian quality to those films as well, because there's a level of escapism that is there for an audience where, you know, we might have in our own lives there's a level of mundanity, and you know, you kind of sometimes there's those existential questions of like, what does it all mean? What does it matter? Like, and what am I doing with my life? Whereas if you escape into a film like this for an hour, of a couple of hours, right, you're embodying the scenario of people whose every decision is life and death, who literally the fate of the human race is on their shoulders, and there's something like super exultant and like empowering about that, and also just in the idea of being able to rebuild yourself, reinvent yourself, reinvent society. There's like a real utopian idea in there as well that's like a bit more positive than I think what we associate zombie films to be, which is this more dystopian point of view, if that makes sense.
And are you working on a new film?
Talking about some stuff, yeah.
We don't have anything specific. Yeah, we've got a bunch of ideas. We're just pulling apart and putting back together.
If I could just drop a couple more compliments about the film itself. One of the
Drop as many as you want.
well, one of the things I really loved about it was the opening chapter, where you've got the two boats stuck on the water, and there's that wonderful dead calmish sense of he's going over there, and well, what are you going to cut to now? Because you've got nowhere to go. To go from that to the whole thing of the boat going up the river, to go from water, boat, land, car, walking, running. It's a wonderful sense of movement throughout the whole thing, and you got the sense that there were a whole lot of little chapters. It just had a wonderful sense of momentum. Again, I'm saying this because you see so many films, so many Australian films that don't really sort of have that quality of just entertaining an audience and keeping you hooked into them about what's going to happen next. So kudos to the pacing of the film.
Thank you. And so much of the credit for that, honestly, should go to our editor, Danny Cooper, because she really helped us find that pace.
Yeah.
You know, she's phenomenal.
And your photography, etc., it's just wonderful. I mean, you're really making that outback look that scary, which is fantastic. Are you happy with the marketing? Are you happy with with the word getting out? People
I mean, it's a tricky thing to quantify, I think. Netflix have a really specific way that they approach that, and I think, you know, given their track record, we have a lot of trust in how they're going to manage that. And then on the Aussie theatrical front, I think it's just a challenging thing. It's a challenging market.
Is
but
the success of The Walking Dead a big part of this? I mean, that's a whole TV series about zombies.
Yes and no.
Yeah,
I mean, because it's kind of like, on one hand, people there's a bit of zombie fatigue creeping in, where people are just like, oh, I've seen enough zombies. We've seen bloody 7-8 seasons of The Walking Dead. And thankfully, we play against a lot of what they do.
That's the great thing
which
about
is
the movie. It's very good.